Chapter 3 is mainly about Grendel, who watches and observes the human behavior from afar as they grow in their society, and is curious and he's curious about human nature on why they do certain things, or like what's going on in their brain as he tries to friend exile, which is shown exiles as which is shown in the chapter. So they start off as tribes, you'll see, and then they'll grow into meat halls. Those meat halls will soon want to fight each other to steal their resources and goods. And Grendel's when they do that, Grendel sees just wastefulness as humans really only seek the violence, and they that's their main goal, leaving him like Grendel disgusted, yet still curious about human nature. Then you'll see later on in the story that King Hrothgar, he slowly grows in power as he unites the meat halls together, building roads, having them swear allegiance, giving tribute to him. And this really intrigues Grendel since this breaks the pattern of human nature. And as he grows in power, Hrothgar grows in power, he attracts the Shaper, where the Shaper, he comes for pay, of course, and he wants, and he sings an exaggerated version of Hrothgar's achievements, which boost soldiers' morale, like makes them proud of their history, even though Grendel knows the true history of the Danes, where they are really just berserkers. They're just violent beasts who just leave destruction everywhere. And this is really the main conflict between Grendel, as he knows the true past, yet what the Shaper sing, he also feels like it's true because of how influential that song is. And this confliction within himself frustrates him, leaving him lost in confusion. And really, this main chapter is just to show that humanity is really selfish and cruel, and they lie in order to to because they're just really prideful, and they consider themselves as righteous men who do good things, and this leaves Grendel in confusion.
Grendel, at its heart, is a story about a character struggling for meaning. Grendel's agency, insanity, and repetition. In Grendel, to be monstrous is to have a lack of agency. Grendel is, eventually, bound only to his most basic instincts and desires. With the first chapter, predating the flashback of the next few chapters, Grendel gives us very clear insight into his monstrosity and lack of agency. He screams in rage against the natural world, while he simultaneously is terrified of the sound of his own huge voice. He plays at greater knowledge, resigning himself as a force of the natural world, as mechanical as anything else in this world, but he is fickle and contrived. We see very clearly that he's subject to no greater logic and has no real control over his actions. He's a monster. Nihilism and Grendel's lack of purpose. Grendel in creation starts out like any other, confused and attempting to make sense of his greater world. Unlike the humans he foils, he is raised in almost total isolation, forced to derive meaning from a mute mother and harsh cave facades. As he ventures further from his mother's domain, he begins to interact with the only other beings Grendel recognizes as sentient, humans, who, at the very least, were not mechanical, the same term he had used to describe himself in the natural world. It is from these humans that Grendel learns the cruel nihilism that he eventually descends into. The senseless, ale-wrought bloodshed and the vigor with which they inflict suffering. They, like he, are almost completely devoid of any greater purpose. And through Grendel's long life he watches, fixated, as the age of Hrothgar passes. That is, until the arrival of the Shaper, and the context he brings to Hrothgar's world. The Shaper brings order into Grendel's pointless world, describing the mechanical ebbs and flows of the natural world with intent and precision. This, in a way, humanizes Hrothgar's people. It recontextualizes their efforts into a world with meaning. In that recontextualization, the Shaper damns Grendel and all of the monsters of the natural world that would oppose the humans. The Shaper is where Grendel initially draws his worldview, where Grendel initially draws his value in juxtaposition to the humans. But the man that gave him this identity damns him and robs him of it. The Shaper intently describes the humans and the natural world in opposition to them, the darkness, the demons, the evil, and Grendel falls squarely among them. The new context of Grendel's world maddens him, and this begins his descent. So, the Shaper, as a nihilist, The Shaper plays at knowledge, but as we see through Greater's later dialogues with the dragon, the Shaper really doesn't know any more of the greater structure of the universe than any other man, no more than Hrothgar. In his efforts to unite the warring tribes and provide meaning, the Shaper unintentionally creates Grendel, perhaps the greatest challenge Hrothgar ever faces. The Shaper, contrary to every other character seen this far, takes initiative. He has that agency that Grendel lacks, and he seeks to exercise it, or so it seems. He trains in a skill that lets him manipulate kings and silence roaring masses. However, in this attempt to assert control over his ultimately impartial universe, the Shaper ensures Grendel's own lack of agency by casting him out from the humans. In Grendel's eyes, he is one of the few sentient beings, yet as he goes to embrace his brothers, his brethren, the Shaper's impact has already been felt. The Shaper's strict classifications into the wholly good and the wholly evil leaves no room for understanding of Grendel as a being stuck fully in transition. In this way, the Shaper's search for meaning ultimately denies Grendel of any, and forces Grendel into the relegated path of chaos that we see later in the story. The Shaper truly has as little agency as Grendel does. He's just monstrous. Right? This is one of the key tenets of nihilism. There is no greater meaning. And in searching for one, you will ultimately make yourself more unhappy. Or awaken an ancient's monster wrath and pull the linchpin on decades worth of bloodshed. It's classic nihilism, really.
All right, so chapter 3 of the Zodiac is actually going to correspond to chapter 3 of Grendel, obviously, and that chapter is Gemini, which is the third sign of the Zodiac, coming after Aries and Taurus. The third sign of the Zodiac is Gemini, also known as the twins of the Zodiac, and so we're just kind of going to explore how this relates to Grendel's story as it's told in chapter 3. Okay, so here's a crash course in astrology, the Gemini edition, courtesy of a 17-year-old girl, because we are always the best astrologers. So Gemini is an air sign, and it is actually the first sign of the Zodiac, meaning that theoretically they would possess the most air-like qualities, because they're kind of hogging it up from all the other signs. Generally, air signs are kind of curious, and they're hard to be tied down, and are very intellectual. So like the air, very out there, things like that. Also, Gemini is represented by the twins, and it is seen in the constellation that actually represents Gemini. This shows the elements of dualism as well as like sort of this hypocrisy that is seen in common interpretations of Gemini astrology, because the twins are supposed to be in opposition to one another. Now, Gemini is ruled by the planet of Mercury, which in both Roman mythology and in modern astrology, both of them, is the planet / the god that represents communication and relationships. As well, mercurial traits include wit, intellect, and rhetoric, and the ability to pick things apart and put them back together again. So that's why whenever you see like in your horoscope that Mercury's in retrograde, like everybody freaks out, because it's like, oh my god, but like nobody actually knows what that means. Well, this is what that means. So some traits that are typically seen in Geminis are that they are curious, insatiably curious, adaptable, accepting of quick change, but at the same time, they're also said to be really inconsistent, sometimes unreliable or indecisive. Okay, I just wanted to take a moment to say that I know there's a lot of hate towards Geminis, but I think that they can be very nice people, and this can kind of prove that. Okay, so Gemini as seen in chapter 3. Is Grendel a Gemini? No, probably not. He's like way more of an Aries in my opinion. But this chapter definitely contains many elements of Gemini, just generally. So we're going to be relating to the air qualities that we discussed before. So this is the first chapter in which we like really see the nature of Grendel's curiosity, because obviously in chapter 2 we did see that he had fallen into like the trap thing and had to be saved by his mother once the humans came. But in those previous chapters, Grendel had only visited the human world for short trips, and he always returned for dawn. But in this chapter, we learn that Grendel has been making regular visits to the human world and has actually been watching over them, not watching over them, but watching them and seeing the way that their world works for a very long time, just because he couldn't resist his curiosity, which is a very air sign thing to do. He also deals with the concept of intellectuality when he begins to ponder the ideas and reasons behind the humans' war, and that comes at the very end of the chapter, after the Shaper is singing his like song on the harp, and Grendel like goes home and he's like totally confronting just like the ideas of violence and what war is. Okay, so then next up is the twins, which is basically going to represent like duality and sometimes a little bit of hypocrisy. So the main aspects of duality that we have here in this chapter have to do with the abstract concept of truth, as we'll discuss later on when it comes to sophism in this chapter, which is the dominant philosophy. So Grendel struggles with understanding the duality of violence as well as peace, and how oftentimes the two can be intermingled. And basically I mean that we understand that all of the tribes or the clans have been at war with one another, but the way that the Shaper and the way that Hrothgar is portraying that is that it's a time of peace and it's a time of allyship, when at the same time there's been so much violence and there's been so much warfare. So it's kind of like a duality in that way. As well as he's living a bit of a dual life himself, because he's spending so much time watching over the human world despite it not being his true home. So yeah. Next up we have just Mercury as a planet. And ironically, there's a complete lack of communication in this chapter. Like Grendel barely talks to anybody except for the watchdogs that he has, that he just sort of interacts with sometimes. Yes, Grendel cannot verbally communicate with his mother at all, which is basically the only other character in the story at this point that he actually knows. And he refuses to communicate with the humans that he watches from the shadow. So the only true communication we see is the violence between tribes and that song that the Shaper sings at the end, which causes Grendel to question his own memory. However, this chapter does deal plenty with the idea of piecing things back together again. Hrothgar does this when he forms the alliance with the 6 nearest tribes, and he's sort of piecing together a very war-torn area. And also Grendel does this as he walks home at the end, trying to piece together his ideas of truth, of violence, of warfare, and kind of how humans live. And then